What do you think is going through Kris's head right now? Do you think they're happy, now that they found a way to escape their troubles? Do you think they're scared? Their actions could bring about the end of the world. They know this, and yet, here they are. Do you think they're unsure? Knowing the risk, do you think they will soon regret putting their mother in danger? No matter what they are thinking, it is clear that they are determined. But how? As Queen explained, any lightener can create a dark fountain, if they have determination. We were under the impression that the human soul was the source of determination, and only a few monsters could use it themselves. Given recent events, that is no longer the case. So I wonder, what is the source of Kris Dreemurr's determination? They didn't get it from us, considering we're wedged inside the couch, so where? What is their driving force? What allows them to persist? What do they want? As far as we know, Kris has never been competitive. They don't strive for physical or academic accomplishments. They don't live for the sake of money or personal gain, so what is it? What is the source of Kris's determination? Let's find out. Hello again, people, and welcome back to rather, I am back to talk about Holy crap, these new chapters absolutely ruined me. Huh? What? What's that, Toby? You've been waking up in the middle of the night, unable to go back to sleep because you've been thinking about the scenes in this game? Well, now so am I. I have it now. You gave it to me. The Deltarune-itis. I don't know if it's like a video game honeymoon period or something, but I have been thinking about Deltarune every day since I finished the 2 new chapters. Just the other day, I went to my freezer to get some chicken nuggets, and I was like, Snowgrave. Yes, I am stupid, what of it? Sometimes it's the music. Other times it's the characters, and how I just want them to be okay. And the only way, I think, I'll feel better, is if I concentrate my 2 brain cells and put together my thoughts in video form. So that's what I'm doing. Useless analysis. Me. Over a year ago, I made a series of videos, a Deltarune character analysis series. I said that if the new chapters were to prove me wrong, I would make new content to update the series. And yeah, I was proven wrong. And I have a lot more to say. So, let's get started. I think we should be expecting our first character here pretty soon. Oh, there they are. Please give a warm welcome to Kris Dreemurr. Yeah, hey Kris, hey, what's up? How are you doing today? Awesome, good to hear it. Okay, so I'm gonna get started, but I'm in a little predicament. I wanted to get right into the new chapters, but I also understand there's a lot of new Deltarune fans since the release. So, considering the older videos are somewhat outdated, I am going to start every new video with a crash course of the character in question. If you already know everything about Kris from chapters 1 and 2, please skip to this timestamp. Okay, I hope you're ready, because I'm going to give you a Kris crash course. Yeah, Kris crash course. How's that for a tongue twister? Hello and welcome, this is Kris Dreemurr. Kris is the adopted child of Toriel and Asgore Dreemurr. They live in a somewhat rural, small town appropriately named Hometown. Toriel is a teacher at the local school, while Asgore was recently let go from the police department for unknown reasons. Kris was adopted at a young age. We don't know the specific time frame or circumstances of their parents' departure. The story of Kris's parents is still unknown, yet the effects of such weigh heavy on them still. There are certain books you can read in the town's library. If you open up a book about humans, Kris closes it quickly, almost out of fear or resentment. Kris does not adhere to a specific gender. They are non-binary, using they/them pronouns. This is worth mentioning because as of late I have noticed that a lot of new fans refer to Kris as he/him. Honestly, this is not uncommon to make this mistake if you're new. There is a can of deodorant downstairs that is specifically labeled as for boys, so you might assume that it belongs to them. And some people don't realize it actually belongs to Kris's older brother, Azrael. For the sake of consistency and not perpetuating the misconception further, if I see a comment that addresses Kris as he/him, I'm gonna be removing it. You should know better because, well, I'm telling you right now. Like I said, Kris has an older brother, Kris Dreemurr. Azrael is the biological son of the Dreemurr family, and he's kind of a big deal in hometown. Azrael was known by several people for his kind heart, his singing talent, and his generosity. As of this moment, Azrael is believed to be a good brother to Kris. He would take Kris to the local diner very often and buy them hot chocolate, take the time to make sure Kris was taken care of amidst their parents' divorce, and the two of them would just spend a lot of time together in general. It should be noted that due to visual context clues in Azrael and Kris's room, it could be inferred that there is a little bit of resentment between the two. More specifically, a certain amount of favoritism from their parents. I mean, just look at the difference here in the rooms. Azrael has a computer, all of these awards, and Kris just has this birdcage. All of this context is important so that people understand the weight of Azrael's departure. Azrael left for college some time ago, leaving Kris with little support. Azrael is planning to make a return soon. By my estimation, Azrael will return in Chapter 5. I should also mention that there is a small theory in the community that Azrael is actually dead and going to college was just a cover-up for his death, but this has been mostly debunked as of right now. Kris has been described as a prankster, often scaring other people or jumping into the light fixture of their neighbor's house, specifically the one belonging to their family friends, known as the Holidays. The Holidays are another prominent family that lives in hometown. We have Rudolph and Carol, the parents, and the two children, December and Noel. December's name is usually shortened to Des. The Dreemurr family and the Holiday family have a close bond, interacting with each other whenever they can. However, the two families have not been as close as they were before ever since Des disappeared. The Noel video will cover the Holiday family as a whole, so be on the lookout for that sometime later. Kris is the only human in hometown, as it is predominantly filled with monsters. Monsters and humans are distinctly different as far as we know. Humans have incredibly powerful souls, and this ethereal power source known as determination. Very, very few monsters possess determination. Instead, they are mostly made of magic, so a monster cannot bleed. Okay, I guess they can. Forget everything I just said. And we will talk about more of that in Susie's video. Still, as a human, they possess a very powerful human soul, and that is where we come in. Right before the credits roll in Deltarune Chapter 1, Kris wakes up from their bed, rips out the soul, and traps it inside the previously mentioned birdcage. While inside the birdcage, the player can still use the arrow keys to move the soul around, while Kris moves automatically. Kris produces a knife and turns towards the camera, sending us a clear message that they have their own autonomy as well. This meta-narrative bombshell is clearly explaining that the player and Kris are two separate entities, with different motives. In the current understanding of the lore, this is unprecedented. A human's body cannot last without the soul, and the soul can only be separated from the body after the human dies, and on top of that, humans cannot trade souls. There is potentially more information in the library that could explain this phenomena, but this big-eyed mother effer will not get out of the way. Kris stores us inside their chest when in use. During this time, we have almost complete control over everything they do and say, until we don't. When Kris feels inclined, they jam their hand inside their chest and rip us out. Kris typically does this when they are alone, as if this is something they don't want other people to see. This remains one of Deltarune's greatest mysteries. This also is one of the reasons why it is difficult to do one of these types of videos on a character like Kris Dreemurr. They rarely speak. When they do speak, we cannot hear them, and, as it would appear, they do not like us or trust us. Perhaps their soul was taken from them, or damaged in some way, so we are being used as a prosthetic of sorts, a temporary stand-in. Perhaps we the player have hijacked Kris's soul, and our own determination allows us to move independent from them. Kris has been cited to also possess incredible music talent. In the past, Kris would play a piano in the hospital. On other occasions, they would play the piano at the holiday residence to entertain their childhood friend, Noelle. Whenever we try to play the piano, Kris slams their hand down onto the piano either in defiance or because we do not have the ability to play. Prior to the beginning of the game, Kris had very few friends. Sure, they were on speaking terms with most of their classmates, yet they didn't spend an extended amount of time with them outside of school, with Caddy being the only exception. Kris did have one enemy, or bully rather. Susie, surname unknown, has moved to hometown recently, and much like Kris, she doesn't have many friends. Susie is the class bully and would terrorize other students if she felt so inclined. Most of this was a tough monster act, to push people away as a means of self-defense, but when it came to Kris, things became slightly more personal. On 2 separate occasions, Susie would mention Kris's mother, either in passing or to dig at Kris's potential insecurities. This heavily implies that Susie is jealous of Toriel, or perhaps has neglectful parents. Evidently, this awful treatment did not sway Kris in the slightest, as they carried no ill will towards Susie, even rushing to her aid towards the end of Chapter 1. Due to several context clues, Kris appears to have a sense of admiration for Susie. The true reason for this is still unknown. All we know for sure is that Kris values Susie's life tremendously. Kris and Susie look inside the school supply closet one day to find a brand new world inside. Simultaneously, there is this prophecy that features them, claiming that they and the Dark Prince, Rousey, will save the world. To do this, they must find and seal these things called Dark Fountains, which were made by this currently unnamed enemy faction. Essentially, these dark fountains are made by people in the light world by channeling this power called determination. They channel this power into a sharp object, allowing them to pierce through the fabric of reality. From that dark fountain, the surrounding area will be morphed beyond recognition, and inanimate objects will be given life, memories, and desires. The only way to seal a dark fountain is to use a human soul to close it, seemingly also using determination for this process. It should be noted that all Lightners possess the power of determination in some way, and yet supposedly, only a human soul can seal fountains. Little is known about this underground group aside from that they are led by this shadowy entity known as the Night. The Night wants to open up more dark worlds, which according to the prophecy will bring about the Roaring. The Roaring is a catastrophic event which will destroy both the light and dark worlds respectively, and it is the job of the Lightners to stop this from happening. The chips are stacked against them, but as long as our 3 heroes stick together and trust each other, I'm sure they can stick it. Oh yeah, that's right. Chapter 2 ends with Kris seizing control from us and opening a dark world for themselves. This is the story of Deltarune so far. So now let's begin the actual analysis. I'm going to start things off by extending an olive branch of sorts. Before Deltarune Chapter 3, I was a firm believer in third entity theory. If you're not familiar, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a theory that states that Kris's body is inhabited by the player, Kris themselves, and a third nefarious entity. With the release of the new chapters and the events within, I can say with certainty, the third entity theory is dead and buried. This is Kris. The evidence for this being Kris is staggering, and I just wanted to clarify that going forward. I was wrong. It's important to identify this out of the gate because we can now classify every single action taken by Kris without the soul as their choice. Honestly, this makes my job a little bit easier. This is a character analysis with the overarching goal to identify what the source of Kris's determination is. Determination is defined as the ability to try to do something, even though it is difficult. As it stands in Deltarune's lore, determination is a source of power. Not necessarily physical, but great strength can be derived from it. Essentially, this psychological trait which allows people to persist in times of strife is a measurable thing in this universe. The overall goal will be to identify the source of that power psychologically. The amount of determination one has is usually dependent of their character, who they are, what they want, and what they are willing to do to get it. Intent is informed through actions, and I see no better place to start than Kris's most morally dubious action, the creation of a dark fountain. To create a dark fountain is to create fiction on an unprecedented scale. To create a dark fountain, you must concentrate on the things you want, your desires, your dreams, and by using your determination, you can apply your will into a weapon, thus piercing the veil of reality. Dark fountains have remained mostly consistent in such that we have no idea how the hell they work. We have to assume most things about them until we get a solid source of what they are. Everything in the vicinity of a dark world changes upon activation. The area becomes wide and open. Certain objects in the vicinity become darkness to inhabit this new world. The dark worlds are illusions, alternate views of reality through the lens of shadow. In a philosophical sense, a dark world is a piece of art, given life, a massive work of fiction directly correlated to the person who made it. In Chapter 2, we gather everything in the old classroom. When we enter the castle town, these objects disperse in the form of these tiny white lights that I will be calling Lightner Spawn. These Lightner Spawn can be seen a split second before the creation of every dark world, so it can be inferred that these lights are the ideas, bursts of creativity of the person making it. I'm pretty sure this is a visual representation of the person creating the darkness that will inhabit the dark world, or at least gathering inspiration for them. Creating a dark world should be perceived as an incredible responsibility, but we all know it totally isn't, considering how haphazardly they are opened. Which brings us to Kris, the progenitor of this world specifically. Why did they do this? At the end of Chapter 3, the knight appears to try and take Toriel. At least, that is what is perceived to be happening. Susie leaps in front of the knight's tractor beam, and a fight ensues. Whether you beat them or not, the knight strikes down the party. If you do manage to beat them, they spare Kris, laying their blade on their shoulder, allowing Kris to take a dive. Undyne crashes the party in plot-convenient fashion. Don't worry, they accounted for that. And the knight simply grabs Undyne instead of Toriel. Susie springs into action again to save Undyne, and now we must follow her outside of the dark world. When we leave, we can clearly see several of Undyne's spears, and Susie completely lost in the dark. This is more than likely the reason why Undyne took so long to get here. She found herself disorientated by the surrounding cold and darkness, and had to slowly, but surely, find her way out of the darkness, marking her progress with her spears. Susie and Kris follow the knight's trail all the way to the shelter. Before it closes, they can clearly see another dark world inside, and it closes. Susie leaves. The door opens specifically for Kris, and the credits roll. Okay, so what just happened? Before the end of Chapter 2, Kris ripped us out, went outside while Toriel and Susie were distracted. Toriel did not go looking for them, even though they were gone for a very long time. When Kris returns, Toriel offers to let Susie stay the night. The reason for this is because Toriel went outside to find her tires slashed. She panicked and called the police. Sneaking outside and slashing Toriel's tires was a direct choice from Kris, but doesn't seem really conducive to the plan of capturing Toriel. If anything, the best course of action would be to ask Toriel if Susie can stay the night, and open up a dark world while Toriel is asleep. This is not what Kris did, and I believe there are two possible outcomes to what they are planning, with slight deviations. Kris slashed the tires knowing that Toriel would notice them, be spooked, and call the police. Officer Undyne would arrive, and the Roaring Knight would use this opportunity to capture both of them. The other interpretation I came up with is slightly more favorable. Kris was ordered to put Toriel in a vulnerable position to be captured, but Kris knows that they also need Officer Undyne, and they don't want their mother to get hurt. So, to try and buy time for her, they spook Toriel and indirectly lure Officer Undyne to their house, and allow the knight to take her instead of Toriel. Now, if you believe that both of these plans are a little crazy, I cannot blame you. Kris is in contact with Carol Holiday, The voice on the cell phone is confirmed to be her at the end of the weird route variation of the ending. Therefore, we can assume that Kris was following orders when they opened up this dark world. Kris opened up the dark world and went along with this plan. So, is it truly cut and dry that Kris was willing to sacrifice their mother? Well, I don't want to believe that, but based on what we are shown, it's hard to say. Now, if I don't believe something is the case, then I will argue for my side. But be aware that I know things are not looking good for Kris right now. Tenna is keeping Toriel hidden, but a very easy to overlook line of dialogue is that Tenna refers to the grand prize, Toriel, as this dark world's greatest treasure. Kris made this dark world, and as we will talk about a bit later, Tenna is actually taking orders from Kris. I genuinely believe that despite her flaws, Kris absolutely loves their mother. The knight was supposedly trying to take Toriel. Susie assumes this, and for now, we might just have to assume that as well. I have to say, I have my doubts. I find it very interesting that the knight was using this weak little tractor beam to take Toriel, but when Undyne shows up, the knight goes all 5th Colossus and just immediately flies her away. So, maybe the plan was never to take Toriel? Later, when Kris is talking with Carol on the phone, there is no mention of Toriel whatsoever. If the knight wanted to, they could have just one-shot the Fun Gang immediately, and then just took Toriel. So maybe the knight was content with just taking Undyne? Okay, so, cards on the table. I have no idea why they needed Toriel and Undyne. When you finally make your way to the shelter, a keypad is revealed with 3 symbols. A pine tree, implying the mayor, an officer's badge, which would be Undyne, and finally the Deltarune, most likely representative of Toriel. That's Deltarune, by the way, not to be confused with the hit game by TOBY Fix called and also not to be confused with the prized possession of W.D. Gaster, who refers to it as
my Deltarune.
Yeah, I know it's confusing. Anyway, moving on. We know that at one point, Undyne, Carol, and a member of the Dreemurr family would need to be there. If my understanding is correct, they needed these 3 people for something, and they were not prepared to ask nicely for their cooperation. This is unfortunately where the context ends, so we can only speculate what they were needed for. Their souls, maybe their knowledge, their blood. Well, no, that can't be right because, as we all know, monsters can't bleed. We don't know what was needed exactly. Hell, maybe Toriel was going to be okay, so maybe it wasn't really that bad if she was taken. On a brief side note, you should have seen my reaction to that cliffhanger. Wow. I'm sorry? Okay. Ever have a cliffhanger so crazy it makes you go? So anyway, back on task. The knight has kidnapped Officer Undyne after attempting to kidnap Toriel. The next day, Kris and Carol Holiday are still on speaking terms, so it would appear that all went according to plan. Was Kris okay with their mother being taken against her will? Or was the plan changed last minute by Kris so they would take Undyne instead? Honestly, I am in more favor of the latter. Kris has made some kind of agreement to do what the mayor says, but they still love their mother. So maybe they are just offering this alternative to keep their mother safe for the time being, just until they can think of something else. A plan such as this would also explain why Kris does different amounts of damage throughout the fight. When the fight begins, Kris is obviously pulling their punches, because technically they are on the knight's side. But if Rouse and Susie are down, they get more serious. If Kris was content with the knight taking their mother, then I don't think they would have put in more effort if they were the last line of defense. If anything, Kris probably put in more effort and did more damage with their attacks because they were the last one standing. They were trying to prolong the fight so Undyne would arrive. This plan, in essence, may seem a little bit crazy, but it's not outside the realm of something Kris is capable of. Kris is a very smart individual, They are actually the number 3 highest grades in the class despite sleeping through most classes. Let's backpedal a bit and talk about Kris's Dark World, because we kinda glossed over that. Let's start by talking about the overall narrative of the Dark World itself. Like I said, the Dark World is directly correspondent to the Lightner who made it. Kris's thoughts, Kris's dreams, their desires, their Dark World. And we can learn a lot about them by paying close attention to everything in this world. Just like with any piece of fiction, it is often a message from the author to the viewer, either intentional or not. If you pay close enough attention, you will begin to notice patterns. The biggest initial takeaway from this is the fact that most of this world derives from television and various shows Kris used to watch. Throughout the chapter, Tenna will remind Kris of how much family time was spent watching TV, the games Kris and Azrael would play. The boards and the TV shows associated with them are all parallel with members of the Dreemurrs and Holidays, Kris's closest friends and family. The cooking show was loved by Kris's mother. The Western show was loved by Kris's father. The rock music was a representation of the music Noelle and Des loved. And the monster movie game was probably for Susie. Technically, that one was extra because we never got to the 3rd board, but it still stands. Each of these games were orchestrated from people that Kris cares about. Azrael being a slight exception, as they would use the TV to play video games. Kris and Azrael loved video games. When playing, Azrael would let Kris use the name brand controller, and he would use the knockoff. He loved Kris that much. Azrael was even in the process of making his own game before he left for college, a game that was never finished. I'm pretty sure the game needed to acquire the Shadow Mantle is the Dark World version of that game. The sheer presence of all of these things in Kris's Dark World tells me that their family is always on their mind. They think about the minor details, the tiny things that they remember their family enjoying, and this Dark World is a way that they are trying to rekindle that feeling of family. Toriel and Asgore are recently divorced, and based on actions from both parents, there are some things that have not been processed. Keeping the reasons secret from us was an interesting decision, and I believe I know why it was made. Kris doesn't truly know either. So far, there have been 0 instances of either parent talking about the divorce with Kris. Granted, this game only takes place across a few days, but either way, it is clear that both parents are on different pages. There is a fundamental conversation that needs to happen between these characters. This is represented in the disagreement between El Niño and La Niño. These 2 Darkners are in a relationship when, mid-fight, they get into an argument and break up. The disagreement between them appears to be random, superfluous, something that is easily fixed if they just talk to each other. You can talk to both of them afterwards and they both appear to be heartbroken over the split up, and just refuse to talk things out. Now, understand, this is not a direct parallel to the Dreemurr's divorce, as we all know that relationship is a lot more complex. Toriel is happy that they are separate while Asgore is not. This is not a representation of the split, rather a representation of how Kris perceives the split. The way that this is handled is simplified, almost from the mind of a child. After an argument, mom and dad don't care about each other, but you know deep down they secretly do. Of course, until this 3rd party comes in and throws a wrench into everything. The presence of Rule's card is actually fitting, even though he wasn't originally intended in the narrative of this Dark World. Coincidentally, he ends up being a perfect stand-in for Sans. This is also probably why it takes Rule so long to turn to stone, as he has literally injected himself into this world's narrative. Eventually, they get rid of Rules and get back together perfectly fine, or they get together with Starwalker. I can't help but believe that this is also what Kris wants, but unfortunately Starwalker cannot go to the light world. Okay, but seriously, Kris wants their parents to get back together, and this appears to be a representation of such. Yes, I know there are instances where you can tell them that they should be more independent, but I will remind you that this would be the player choosing a response, not Kris. Considering most of Kris's Dark World includes nostalgic imagery and scenery from a simpler time, along with Darkners with equally nostalgic memories, I think it's fair to say that Kris shares in this sentiment. They want their parents to get back together. They want to rekindle that nostalgic sense of family and love, but as we all know, that will not happen. Moving on to Kris's time spent in the backstage area, it is clear that these moments are indicative of their memories of Azrael. Their brother was working on a game. Unfortunately, this video game never saw the light of day. I believe that this game is the Dark World version of it. We don't have a clear understanding of how much of the game was completed, so it's hard to say how much was Azrael and how much was Kris filling in the gaps. The levels, especially towards the end, have an uncanny resemblance to the cyber Dark World, which may be a confirmation that Kris was the one who opened it. But honestly, that's just a guess. Des was also aware of Azrael's game, and the cyber Dark World appears to be more focused on Noelle, so it would make equal sense for Des to be the one to make it. If you take Susie upstairs, she will reference what is on the screen, happy that they didn't go to that cyber world. Perhaps these areas, and the entity which Kris talks to, is a result of their subconscious. The subconscious is where we find our most primal thoughts, our most taboo desires. This game as a whole could point towards a side of Kris that is more violent, that lives in the back areas of their mind, hence the seemingly taboo nature of this path. A fair bit of people gave Chapter 3 some flack for being a compilation of minigames rather than a linear progression. I was loving every minute of it because of all the little details we got from the characters. Susie not enjoying the game until she gets to break pots, Rouse following Kris everywhere they go. There are so many little details that can be analyzed. The bulk of this narrative feast comes from the fact that we are watching video game characters play a video game. Video games within video games has always been a narrative interest of mine. Adding an extra layer of fiction to increase your immersion has often been dumped into the camp of gimmicks. The obvious truth is that you are not playing a video game inside of a video game. You are playing the same game, just with different controls and visuals. This realization has more than likely already dawned on Kris, disappointed that they still can't play. The Dark World by design is meant to give the progenitor what they want. The creation of such requires the person to concentrate on their desires. Kris wants nothing more than to be free, to have control over themselves again. And holy crap, this whole situation is a lot more ironic than I initially thought. This is beyond the comedic sense of irony that would get a chuckle. It's like you want something dearly, and the world itself doesn't understand what you mean, so it gives you something so similar but not exact. It almost implies that the specific thing you wanted is impossible, and this whole ordeal is the world rubbing the truth in your face. The truth that you will never be free, not in the way you want. The knife is twisted further, as Tenna periodically reminisces over family time spent watching TV. A nostalgic time for Kris, more than likely taking place before they even knew us. These memories are now a constant reminder of the life they will never get back. As we play more and more, Kris appears to wrestle control from us at certain moments. Questions are asked about Kris's favorite food, as well as Azrael's favorite video game character. Thankfully, Kris is there to take control, giving us the correct answers. They can be seen coughing, selecting the correct answer for us, being the one who knows these answers definitively. If you thought that Kris's favorite food was chocolate, you may have thought so based on what other characters said. You would have also been correct at one point. Chocolate is something that Azrael would buy them regularly. After he left, this flavor only reminds them of the brother that isn't here right now. They instead prefer Toriel's pies. The other one is very telling, as if you talk to Toriel, she will explain how much Azrael loved the Green Lizard character. So you would automatically pick the Green Lizard for this question. Whether you pick the right answer or not, Tenna explains that Azrael was embarrassed for liking the Green Lizard character, making it no longer his favorite. I can't help but take note that Toriel was under a different impression, that her knowledge of her own son was inaccurate. The TV knew more about Azrael than she did. Then again, Toriel was not asked this specific question, so I'm willing to let that one go. If you talk to Ram, one of the plugs from Cyberworld, he will talk about how Kris and Azrael would play together using inanimate objects. Ram seemingly understands Kris on a personal level, identifying that Kris doesn't really want the fun and games that Tenna offers. Instead, they want a game that gives them freedom. Once again, the theme of freedom injects itself into Kris's story. First it was Jevil, then Spamton. This time around, it is Ram, a Darkner who has a previous history with Kris and their brother. Here, you can play the original version of the game you were playing earlier. This game has less flair, and the name itself is never shown, almost intentionally. The first time you try to play, a controller is required, which stops you from seeing the game's title. Leave and you will find an odd controller on the ground, left presumably by Ram or someone else. Kris still waits to put the controller in, as if they don't want us to see what the game is called. They wait to put the controller in 2 more times afterwards, so it feels intentional. It might not be, I just wanted to mention that. If I had to make a guess, I'm pretty sure the game is called Mantle, which makes sense because this game is required to get the Shadow Mantle. The monsters in this game bear a striking resemblance to the ones found in Hometown. The little dinosaurs are Alphys. The blue bird is probably Birdly. The white monsters look like the Dreemurs. Even Noelle seems to make an appearance. There is a placeholder for the white cloak character in the game files that is in the shape of a deer, and there's another placeholder for the character that mimics your movements, the only difference being that this deer is solid black. This earlier version of the game has several narrative implications, but I am mostly concerned with what this means for Kris. To start, I believe that Kris is pretty bummed out that they didn't get the adventure that they wanted. The Dark Worlds can do a lot of things for people. It can let them learn new things about themselves, work out their traumatic experiences, come to terms with their flaws, the works. This is primarily done through the inherent escapist nature of exploring them. The Library Dark World helped Noelle quite a bit, so I believe Kris was hoping that this Dark World could do the same for them. Maybe work things out with their mother, or finally attain that freedom they wanted so badly. But as we know, we still maintain control over Kris, and Toriel was asleep the entire chapter. Still kinda salty about that one, but whatever. In this game, Kris can walk around and seemingly do nothing until they find a sword. From here, they can attack every monster, gaining LV with every kill. Eventually, you max out the LV, and now you can destroy the palm trees that border the level. From here, there are a few secrets. In the room next to the temple lies a message from Chapter 3's secret boss, asking Kris if they are having fun, almost taunting them. Down at the bottom left is a secret path only found after destroying this palm tree. At the end of this path lie several rooms. If you walk inside, you will be met with the previously mentioned secret boss. Destroying the palm trees at the perimeter will take you to this out-of-bounds area filled with many palm trees. This area loops until you find the red chest which contains the ice key. The provocative backdoor nature of this entire sequence gives a sense that whatever we are doing is not intended. Our actions in this area feel secretive, so secret that Ram is worried what would happen should Tenna discover them. On top of that, the nature of gaining power and obtaining the ice key feels secretive in and of itself, like a secret within a secret. I know that getting the key is the only way to progress here, but the way in which we obtain it feels like we are breaking the rules. This chain of events seems intrinsically tied to the events of the weird route. Tiny Kris becomes strong, so strong that they supersede the previous limitations imposed upon them, moving beyond the intended borders of their world. Honestly, this seems to be a more provocative idea of what Kris wanted. They want freedom, but they are limited by the rules and regulations of their world, just like Tiny Kris. So knowing this, are we being told that the weird route will lead to Kris superseding the boundaries of their own world? Kris appears to be against the actions taken in the weird route, opening up a massive can of whoop-ass on us if we go through with it. They don't like this, and they would rather Noelle be safe than become stronger. Control is something that is taken from them. They would not want to see it taken from another person. The theme of control is played with in the second board, as Susie swaps out Kris's controller with her own. Control over the game is switched around a few times, as Susie switches controls with everyone in chaotic fashion. If I were to read into this, I would say that this is a premonition, that Susie will be the one to break the status quo between Kris and the player. This has technically already happened as far back as Chapter 1. Susie can ask you at least 2 questions and we don't get the ability to answer. Typically, when a choice is presented to us, we can use the soul to choose a path. And consistently, Susie has been known to override that mechanic. Perhaps this is the cause for Kris's admiration. Seeing Susie overcome the player's influence gives them hope that one day they will overcome the player's influence. It's almost as if Susie has some semblance of power over the game itself. She just doesn't realize she does. The second level of the backstage area plays similar to the first. Extra features like the camera are not there, and almost all of the interiors are absent, aside from the one where you find the sword. In Tenna's version, there is this secret island you can find that is filled with palm trees. Touching a specific tree will cause all of them to flash in epileptic fashion. Going there now will bring you to an underground area, where you find Tenna talking to himself. It's with this we get confirmation that this game was found and altered by Tenna, altered in such a way that was more structured. The quizzes, the narrative of Lover's Peak, and the places that were previously blocked off. You could argue that Tenna's version had more things to do, but it lacked freedom. Freedom is what Kris wants more than anything in the world, and yet Tenna has removed that from the game. There is a section of the game up north that Tenna refuses to allow you to visit. Even if you get to this area, you cannot progress because there is a tree blocking your path. Susie and Rousey both give their thoughts on this secret area, which I will mention in their videos. Finding this area in the backstage version of this game, you will be able to unlock this door with the ice key you found earlier. Continuing on will bring you to this white cloaked figure, who you can attack and they seemingly take damage, but they will never die. One of the rooms gives you instructions: follow the white cloak. A little confusing considering the white cloaked figure follows you instead. Every time Tiny Kris attacks, the cloaked figure will respond with an ice attack. No doubt a reference to the words, "The forbidden path began with ice magic." Using the cloaked figure to freeze Birdly, I mean this random blue bird NPC, and using her to guide you through a maze, will bring you to another door with the Deltarune symbol. However, something is off. For starters, the wings on the Deltarune symbols are more angular, almost demonic. This goes along with the red horns on both sides of the doorway. There also appears to be a fourth triangle in the rune, when every other time it has been shown with 3. Either this is another version of the Deltarune symbol to go along with this forbidden path, or perhaps this is the real version of the Deltarune. But that's a crack theory for another day. On second glance, it might just be a keyhole. The real important thing is what happens next. When you enter the room, text on the screen says that she was used up, implying that you used the white cloaked figure to open the door. If this figure is supposed to be Noelle, it could imply that Noelle will be sacrificed during the weird route. Inside, the entity from before talks to us again. This entity talks to Kris, and not the player. Supposedly, this is their special hiding spot. After some searching, we find the shelter key, and the entity is satisfied with our work. It would appear that even though they hid the shelter key here, they are pleased with the fact that we were able to find it and take it. Soon after, the text reads, "You were used up." The game crashes, and Kris looks back at us. The takeaway from this sequence is a little fuzzy for me. I'm not really 100% on what the game is trying to say. This could be Kris just looking back at us out of fear or concern, like they are afraid that we would use them and Noelle as items. If this were a weird route, I would not blame them. However, there is another interpretation that stems from the words that are used. The entity seems to not be aware of us because they only address Kris. However, the text on the screen specifically says, "You were used up," not "they were used up," referring to Kris. Especially in the context of a weird route, "you" is almost exclusively used to identify the player. And on top of that, when we turn on the game, the red soul appears on screen before it takes on the form of Tiny Kris. So, is this text potentially referring to us? Like, could we, the soul, be used as an item? And Kris is looking back at us to intimidate us? Honestly, I'm not really sure what the implications here are. It really depends on what the game is trying to say when it says "you." Anyway, moving on. At this point in the story, Susie is getting suspicious of Tenna, and as a result, the gang begins to snoop around to find out what Tenna is keeping from them. Before we get outside, there is a moment where Rousey recommends that we talk to Susie. Now, we could talk to Rousey instead, but he doesn't really give us anything to go off of when Kris speaks. Susie does. Susie explains how she feels about learning that her friend Lancer is just a playing card, and I look forward to analyzing that baggage when we get to Susie. For now, let's talk about how Kris responds to Susie's words and feelings. As you know, when Susie is done, we get access to different dialogue options. And while Susie does technically respond, she pays close attention to the inflection Kris used. This would not be the first time that Kris has listened to instructions while offering up their own spin as a way to rebel against us. Kris takes advantage of the situation, using any bit of freedom they have to mess with us or those around us. Kris is technically doing what we say, they just are ignoring the intended sentiment behind it because, you know, they don't like us. Luckily for them, Susie just passes it off as one of Kris's awkward mannerisms and responds. You can respond to what she says by saying, "I'm not a dream" in a creepy tone, "Your friendships are real" in a heroic tone, or "Sucks to be you," most likely in the deadpan tone normally associated with the way Kris speaks. Kris decides to say, "I'm not a dream," in a way that Susie considers creepy. She obviously isn't scared of her closest friend, but the way Kris said it was amusing for her. This could honestly just be Kris talking to Susie in a way that marks how well they know her. They know Susie loves creepy and gross things like blood, guts, and violence. But this phrase is more calming and reassuring with its intent. As if we gave them the instructions to reassure Susie, but Kris was like, yeah, no, she would prefer it if it was made into a joke. Which is equally supported by the other option. Another reassuring statement that usually would have the intent of comforting Susie, and yet Kris decides to speak in a heroic tone, almost sarcastically, which Susie finds equally enjoyable. These two dialogue options share in that they are altered beyond their intended message to make Susie laugh, while the third one does not. Usually in moments like this, there is a preferred option, one that Kris would want to say, therefore they do not put their own spin on it, wanting to say it from the beginning. When you tell Kris to say, "Sucks to be you," at first it may seem like this would be the least preferred option given that Kris admires Susie. Saying this last option doesn't even make Susie flinch, as she knows that even if these words sound like they have an intent to hurt, they remind her that Kris is right there with her. They have just as few friends as she does. Kris is their only friend, and Susie vice versa. She is reminded of how Toriel was so overjoyed that Kris finally found a friend. Susie looks down, almost as if she feels guilty for all the time she abused Kris beforehand. This conversation marks just how similar the two Lightners are. Outcasts who are labeled by those around them. Kris for being a mute human in a town full of monsters, and Susie being a violent monster everyone is afraid of. I freaking love these two. They share one brain cell and use it to cause chaos wherever they go. I just love it. The final game is much like the first two, aside from the fact that we didn't get to see Tenna's version. This went unused, but is still technically playable. This final board is the most ominous, as you have tiny versions of Rouse and Susie following you. When I played this for the first time, I immediately drew comparisons from the Cyberdark world in Chapter 2. Especially this alleyway where we meet Noelle. The way to progress here is to kill your two party members. Kris looking back to look at us once again. We can't make out exactly what Kris's face looks like, and some people even interpret this as Kris simply looking away from the screen in horror. They aren't smiling, so I can say for sure they did not enjoy watching a tiny version of themselves kill their friends. A premonition, in the vein that further down the line in the weird route, you will have to force Kris to kill Susie and Rouse, making Kris more powerful. Traveling down this manhole will bring you to this darkened area. You know the drill at this point, so I won't bore you except for this one moment. In this specific room, there is this monster that is blackened out. This is the other monster that has a black deer as its placeholder, so I am inclined to believe that this is a stand-in for Des. This sprite follows your movement and works with you to solve this room. Even stranger, you gain control over it for a brief moment. When it gets closer to Tiny Kris, they attack and control is reestablished. Well, that was kinda weird. Did you see what I did there? Okay, so anyway, eventually you find yourself in this room that is akin to the stabbing room in Yume Nikki. And it's very cool that I decided to play that game because now I'm noticing a lot of things that are probably references to it. Come to think of it, I actually noticed a lot of Yume Nikki imagery in these new chapters. You end up finding Tenna once again, and they turn around to notice Kris behind them. This entire time we were under the impression that we don't want Tenna to find us back here, yet he finds us and acts like he is the one doing something wrong. He starts talking about a deal between Kris and him, almost as if there was a conversation between the two that we never saw. Tenna explains that he did what Kris told him to do, out of fear of being turned off. What did Kris ask him to do? What is this deal? Honestly, we're getting more into the realm of theory territory than character analysis, but what the heck, let's rack our brains really quick. What could Tenna be referring to? Well, Kris is the creator of this dark world, and as a result, they would more than likely have a say in what happens in its creation. So, maybe in some strange way, Kris was able to relay information to Tenna without even the player knowing. During certain moments, Tenna thanks the Dark Fountain for making this show possible, but if he witnessed everything in front of the TV, he would know exactly that it was Kris who made the fountain, and thus thank them instead. Yet, he doesn't. It's almost as if Tenna is aware that Kris doesn't want other people to know that they were the ones who made the fountain. Perhaps when the fountain was created, Kris was able to include this deal into the narrative of the world itself. Honestly, this theory isn't too solid, but I would love to hear what you think anyway. So, let's wrap this up. Moving on, we find ourselves at the shelter. Previously referred to as the bunker by the community, something strange begins to happen. Tiny Kris stops and moves away when we get close. Kris is now actively resisting our control, trying to keep us away from the shelter. This establishes a major plot point for these two chapters. Kris is aware of what is inside the shelter, and adamantly does not want us to see inside. After we enter, Kris seems to mellow out a bit, almost as if what they thought was in here isn't. Further in, at the end of the tunnel, lives the entity that has been stalking us in these backroom games this whole time. The way in which they talk to Kris would imply that they are proud of Kris's tenacity, and their possession of the Shadow Mantle would imply that they have a distinct backstory within the Dark Worlds. This person is what I would call a wild card. They seemingly don't work with the Knight or the Fun Gang. Evidently, these two teams intersect, so now there is a potential new faction. We have no idea who this person is or what they want. All we know is that they had the Shadow Mantle, and we're willing to give it to Kris should they win this fight. The sprite of this enemy is literally called Shadow Mantle, so maybe this is the mantle themselves talking to us? But if that was the case, then why would the voice refer to the Shadow Mantle as an item? If it was the Shadow Mantle, it would say, okay, go ahead, you can take me now, but no. It specifically says, you can now take the Shadow Mantle. They ask Kris once again if they are having fun. Is it fun to search for the Shadow Crystals? They talk at Kris, claiming that they are enjoying this. This is more than likely referring to breaking the rules. It's like the entity is goading Kris to try and get them to admit that they like to break the rules. If you were to already complete a weird route in Chapter 2, then they would reminisce, claiming that there's a part of Kris that enjoyed manipulating Noelle, because it wasn't really them. When you beat them, they are overjoyed at Kris's display of violence.
Your eyes can't hide it, Kris. Without play, the knife grows dull.
A reference to Kris's knife, the very same they keep hidden from almost everybody. In this moment, the only people who know about Kris's knife would be us and Toriel, who seemingly doesn't care. I have words to say about Kris's knife, but we'll get to that later. The literal knife that Kris wields is the obvious understanding. However, I think it could equally be referring to Kris's mind. Think about it. If you suddenly lost control of your body as some other entity was using it to move around, you would eventually forget to think for yourself. And with that, I think I now realize why Kris walks around like this without the soul. It's like their limbs are all numb because they are forgetting how to use them. This interpretation is equally scary. If we, the player, continuously make decisions for Kris, like where to move, who to talk to, or what to say, then it really wouldn't surprise me if Kris's sense of self began to disappear. Your mind is often referred to as sharp in allegorical terms, and in this specific situation, the word play could refer to, well, anything. Any type of movement or action that would take place. After we win, the facade finally falls. The Shadow Mantle holder... okay, hang on. Can we sidebar for a second? Is that really the name we're going with? Can I, petition the Deltarune community to come up with a cooler name? Maybe something like the Demon, or maybe the Glitch in the Code, or maybe the Laughing Shadow, or something like that. But seriously, any name that isn't Shadow Mantle holder. Leave a suggestion for a name and upvote the ones that you like the most. Because, well, come on, I think we can come up with a better name than Shadow Mantle holder. As I was saying, the facade falls. When Kris reaches the end of the game's threshold, little Kris exits the screen and makes their way down next to Kris. If you use the attack button, Kris will fall back out of fear. Now you have the ability to control regular Kris to grab the Shadow Mantle. This was never truly a game, just a hyper-specialized area within the Dark World that gave off the impression that it was a video game. Susie has finally lost her patience and walked in to find Kris playing all by themselves. She asks if Kris is really having fun playing here with no one else. Reply with no, and she will tell you that if the game is not enjoyable, then don't play. If you say that playing games is fun, she will again reference how lame it is to play games by yourself, only this time comparing Kris to Birdly. The intended response isn't clear, but I would wager it would be Kris saying no. They are not having fun. They still don't have the control they wanted, and the game they were playing for the past few hours wasn't even a game. This is the harsh truth in the end, isn't it? The Dark Worlds are a fantastic source of escapism, yet there are fundamental factors about the Dark Worlds that cannot be changed. Now would be a good time for a little break, so let's talk about something else. This video is all about Kris, but there are some things I would like to talk about that are about Kris, but not specifically a part of their character. This section is for that purpose. For a couple minutes, I want to throw out some ideas in the form of thought experiments. Let's talk about Kris's perceived relationship with the player, and what a hectic relationship it is, by the way. For the most part, Kris tosses us in a box or a cage to keep us from running away, but Chapter 4 is a little exception. They lose sight of us, and as a result, we move all throughout the Holiday Mansion, causing havoc wherever we go. This all crescendos with the both of us stuck inside the closet, trying to make noise so Susie and Noelle discover us and the guitar code. The interactions between us are very comedic in nature. Tom and Jerry-ass relationship. I stole that joke, by the way. This entire course of events has had me thinking lately. Well, it's been making me think of two things, so I'll start with the easier one first. Kris and the player's antics are completely rationalized away by Noelle, claiming that this is one of Kris's pranks. I myself have used the Kris is a prankster explanation earlier in this video. But what if we are wrong? Walking all the way up to these Valentine's Day hearts will remind Noelle about a time where Kris supposedly pranked Noelle by pretending to rip out their own heart. Later in the level, the soul momentarily takes recluse inside the closet by hiding among the hearts inside. It's almost as if the game is subconsciously directing us to the fact that the soul is in the shape of a heart. It's not physically Kris's heart, it's a soul. But the reason why it takes this form is, well, you'd have to ask Toby Fox about that. But I am certain that this game is drawing this comparison for a reason. Noelle did not see Kris pretend to rip out their heart. Kris messed up royally and took out the soul while she was watching. They simply passed it off as a prank because it was a better alternative than saying, hey, this outside entity is controlling my soul and I can't stop it from controlling me sometimes. It makes me wonder further, if this specific instance, and potentially past instances, were not pranks, but Kris fighting with the soul, then what if none of them were pranks? What if they were all labeled as such because no one truly understood what was going on? Think about the weird route sequence in Chapter 4. Noelle recounts that last night, Kris explained that everything that happened in the hospital was simply a prank. She was very quick to believe that. I mean, think about it. This wouldn't be the first time that Kris was misunderstood, and this wouldn't be that hard to believe given Toriel's misunderstanding of humans. She appears to be completely content with just letting Kris run off for extended periods of time, never questioning the literal bloodstain in Kris's room, or the bird cage when she knows damn well that Kris doesn't own any birds. It is possible to an ignorant monster that something like this could be considered normal. Honestly, the only reason we know it isn't normal is because most of us played Undertale, and something like this would not be possible in Undertale. All of Kris's hijinks, not being hijinks at all, would kind of make sense at this point. This now brings me to the other, more interesting and yet more difficult to prove idea. Why is Kris so adamant towards us? Like, we take away Kris's autonomy, make them walk around and all that, but honestly, it's not like we have a whole lot of power either. The soul is supposed to be this incredibly powerful thing, yet we can get stunned by a well-placed object being thrown at us. Kris can speak. Barely, but they can speak. And they don't need us to do it considering they call Carol on the phone. So why don't they speak to us? Why can't we speak to them? why is Kris not on speaking terms with us? One might as well ask why this situation happened in the first place, but I feel we would just be going in circles at that point. I believe I speak for a lot of people when I say that things between the player and Kris could be understood better if we just had a simple conversation with them. Considering we don't, there may be a good reason. Has it ever bothered you, dear viewer, that there are gaps in our understanding of events, even though we are supposedly there the whole time? It definitely bothers me. For example, our earliest memory of Kris is at the very beginning of Chapter 1, even though they supposedly could take out their soul long before that. So why do we not have any prior knowledge of Kris? And on top of that, why do we have no knowledge of what happens in between Chapters 3 and 4? While I can't answer that question, I think I have a good reason why we don't know anything about Kris pre-Chapter 1. And of course, I'm talking about in-game knowledge. What if this is all we know because this is the moment we enter the world? Like, what if Kris already had a separate soul that was bothering them beforehand, and it tried to ruin their life? In a dialogue option that can play during the church scene, Susie mentions how Kris and Caddy were rumored to summon a demon, something that was initially hinted at. With the extra reference, this is a good amount of confirmation that we need to understand this animosity. We are the demon that was summoned. Well, not exactly. I mean, I may be an 8-foot-tall bird with a top hat that can shoot lasers from my eyes, but I'm not a demon. You know, what if Kris had prior experience with another soul, and that soul was more malicious? At the beginning of Chapter 1, we are assigned to Kris even though we were tasked to build our own vessel. What if Kris had a previous soul that was assigned to them, and it was either lost or removed permanently? This previous soul was controlled by someone else and tried to hurt people around Kris. So as a result, they hate us not knowing that we are a new soul altogether. Honestly, this is a crack theory at this point, so it's not really possible. But I would love to hear what you guys think. Moving on. Kris wakes up in their chair, still recovering from their night of fighting the night. Susie is already wide awake, eating her fill of pancakes. The pancakes are unfortunately a trap, as Toriel has the audacity to politely invite Susie to church. We have some interesting character moments if you choose to explore the house with Susie. The fact that Kris owns a bird cage confuses Susie, and that's good, because that is the correct response. Why the hell would someone with no interest in birds own a bird cage? Also, a brief side note, the existence of this bird cage obviously implies the existence of birds and other small animals. So, yeah, that kind of makes things weird for bird monsters, doesn't it? Sorry, I just wanted to mention that. I just feel like I have to say something, bird issues, Susie also notices the blood stain on the carpet in Kris's room. She explains that all you need is some vinegar and hot water to clean it up, and yes, that is typically what you would use, if the stain was fresh. Usually, if blood is allowed to sit and dry somewhere for too long, it cannot be cleaned up all the way. But honestly, I doubt it really matters. What does matter is that Susie is helping Kris heal. Not physically, but emotionally, She notices the bloodstain and helps Kris clean it up. She notices that Kris doesn't have any awards and steals one for them. She notices these tiny inadequacies in Kris's life and works to change them, because they're friends. You'll notice that these are things that Toriel could have noticed and rectified a lot earlier, yet she didn't, but we'll get to that later. Walking in front of the mirror in the hallway in the previous chapters has always made allusions to Kris's idea of the self. Chapter 1 said that it's only you, clearly playing off the inadequacies that Kris may feel towards their brother, implied by the disparaging level of awards. In Chapter 2, the flavor text says, "It's what they call you." At this point, it has been revealed to the player that they are a separate entity from Kris, and their sense of self is not an accurate representation due to the player's influence. Kris is unsure of who they are due to their actions being taken over by an outside party. All of that washes away here, because now Kris is looking into the mirror with Susie beside them. You felt like, whatever you were, just for now, it might be okay. Kris and the player have no idea what Kris is exactly. Like I said, their situation is unprecedented. The literal all-knowing prophecy regards them as a cage that just so happens to have a human soul in parts. Is Kris human? Yeah, they have a human body, but what about their soul? Your body is a physical representation of yourself, but your true self comes from your mind, your feelings, and emotions. Kris is not the most emotional person, except for very specific circumstances, and a lot of Kris's mind would come from their soul, which is us. So, what is Kris? They are a person that can sometimes move autonomously from the soul which usually inhabits them. Flowey is the only known example of a person who had no soul, and as we know, he eventually completely lost his sense of self. He became a monster only fueled by a savage mantra of kill or be killed. I wonder at times if Kris can feel themselves fading away, which is what prompts them asking when they began to be themselves. It is an existential question that no one has the answer to, but all of that can fly out the window in this moment. Kris is standing next to their best friend, one of their only friends. They would fall on a spike for her, and she would probably do the same for them. In this moment of catharsis, they know that it doesn't matter what they end up being, Susie will still be there for them, and that means that everything will be okay. Let's go to church. It's Sunday, and there's no school. We have the entire town to explore, so what's the first thing we do? We go to church. And we learn a little bit about the Deltarune legend. As far as the lore goes, there is plenty to be had, but we are mainly concerned with Kris lore for now. If you don't pay attention, you can have a very cute moment where Kris and Susie tag each other with stickers. Or, very rarely, if you don't have any items, Susie can look inside Azrael's pockets and find a letter that was intended for Caddy when they went to prom together, which prompts Susie to say how it must have been difficult to always be the cool one. To which Kris nods after pausing for some time. This would probably be a good time to jump ahead a bit and talk about Kris's opinion of Azrael. I made it a point to explain how good of a brother Azrael was to Kris, but in actuality we can only guess based on things we are told. A lot of people within the dark world and light recollect how close the siblings were, yet every time Kris has a chance to remember or speak of Azrael, they appear to have some level of apathy. Later you get the chance to pray for Azrael, and Susie looks over and notices that Kris doesn't seem to care. If you meet Onion in Chapter 1, you can name them Azrael too. There appears to be some semblance of resentment between the siblings. Kris, as we have mentioned, cares about their family, and even though it might only be subconscious, they miss the days where their family would spend time together. From what we have gathered, Azrael was always there for Kris. So when Azrael left, even if it was on good terms, it may have affected Kris more than anyone ever knew. Also, really quick, I forgot to mention this earlier, but on the refrigerator, Susie notices a photo of Azrael, and naturally mentions how similar Rouse looks. But Kris appears to be adamant about how different they look. I mean, even if we go by Azrael's Undertale appearance, it's actually very clear how different they look. With this confirmation, we could probably assume that Azrael looks almost identical to his Undertale counterpart. After the service, you can go talk to Noelle, Toriel, and Rudy. And look at that, Rudy! Rudy's up and about, yay, maybe his condition is improving. Ooh, sorry, I think I might have jinxed it. After asking around, it looks like the information they need is located at the holiday residence. As they make their way there, we have some more character moments. If you decided to begin the Onion quest chain thingy, you will get a dialogue that says that they aren't there today. And unfortunately, I'm pretty sure this also locks you out of this funny little scene between Kris and Susie. She tries to throw a rock across the lake and fails miserably. Kris stifles a laugh, and it's with this I would like to point out that we are seeing more and more of Kris's personality bleed through, even though we are there with them. There was this sprite cut from Chapter 2 of Kris blushing because they were embarrassed, and it always kind of bothered me that they never used it. I really like when these little glimmers of personality shine through our eldritch horror level of control over Kris. I honestly wish I could just give Kris full control, let them decide where to take Susie, but that wouldn't be good for gameplay. If you borrowed $5 from your brother, you can take Susie out to lunch at the diner. From here, Kris reenacts a typical day between them and Azrael when they were younger. After church, he would take Kris to the diner and then get them hot chocolate, while drawing on the windows with their breath. It seems as though Kris is using Susie as a way to relive these nostalgic memories. Not necessarily because Susie reminds them of Azrael, far from it, but rather it's to show a level of care between them. This routine is a positive mental stim for Kris, and it's a big deal that they choose to share it with Susie. Also, as much as it was kind of annoying for me, it was a pretty smart choice to not tell us directly what Kris wrote at the end. Leaving it up for interpretation is usually the best way to get people to discuss it. And would you look at that, that's exactly what we're doing. Unfortunately, you can't see it if you go to the outside of the window, which I thought that you had to do, but no, it's lost forever. Okay, so what do I think Kris wrote here? Well, first of all, I have no idea. I can only guess. Susie draws a version of Kris that says, Susie rules, and if I had to guess, Kris does the inverse. However, Susie adamantly says that she would never say that, which leads me to believe that I might be wrong. Susie actively defends Kris whenever she can, so I could easily see her saying that Kris rules. Honestly, it beats me, but if the parallels between this moment and what Azrael and Kris used to do together, maybe Kris made Susie say something that was more sentimental or affectionate. And as we all know, even though Susie cares, she isn't comfortable openly expressing affection for people. As for the final thing you can write, I see it going two ways. Either Kris is sending Susie a message that we cannot see, or they literally wrote the word something. Because, Kris be goofy like that. The more fun option would be that Kris is trying to tell Susie something without us knowing. Maybe it's a warning, like, we shouldn't fight the knight if we see them again, or maybe it's them alerting Susie to our presence, saying that they have a demon living inside their soul. They made a very good decision keeping the answer from us because, well, if they didn't, this part would just be simply me reciting the plot, and then I say, oh wow, look how close they are with each other, or something like that. Sometimes it's just more fun if you don't know. Noelle has been kept waiting long enough, so let's get into the meat of the business partnership between Kris and Carol Holiday. Susie and Kris are invited to Noelle's house under the guise that they are working on their project together. Hilariously, Susie doesn't try to hide the fact that they are snooping around, but Noelle doesn't really care as long as Susie's here. At the very least, this is confirmation that Noelle is not in on anything that Carol is planning. If she were, then I doubt she would be cool with this. Eventually, Kris steps away and can search the house freely. Our search leads us to December's room, which appears to be untouched from the last time she was here. Several broken instruments along with other random items litter the room. On the walls, we see the same glow-in-the-dark stars found on Azrael's side of Kris's room. Up against the closet lies a single guitar. When you look closely, you notice that there is a code etched into the inside. But before we can read the code, Kris rips us out and tosses us into a storage closet. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. As much as it sucks that Kris is essentially working with the enemy, this is actually good news. We finally get some context as to what Kris is doing whenever they rip us out. In the past, Kris has taken the soul out to either show off their sick knife, or to open up dark worlds with said knife, and now we have context for all of these actions. This is not only the first time they did this during the day, but also the first time they did so to stop us from accomplishing something. Kris does not want us to get the code to the shelter, just like they didn't want us to see the shelter back in Chapter 3. We now know that whatever is in there is the key to Carol's plan, and by association, the Knight's plan. For now, I'm just assuming that the Knight and Carol are working together. It's implied, but then again, some people believe they're the same person. After we escape, we must be sus, and use the vent, because we are the impostor from among us. Hey, remember 2018? Honestly, as out of left field as this reference was, I could go for some 2018 right about now. We make our way over to the kitchen to find Kris making themselves a glass of chalky milk. At least, that's what it looks like. The Sprite literally says drink, so I'm not sure, but that's what I'm going with. We also get a hint of a conversation, only hearing a few pieces of dialogue. From this conversation, we learn that there is going to be a sacrifice involving Undyne next week. A dark world will be opened in the church tonight. Also, Kris cannot do it without the soul? Well, wait, that can't be right, because Kris clearly opened up one at the end of chapter 2. Again, these are only trace bits of dialogue, and Kris doesn't really say anything back, so it's almost certain we are missing context. For now, going off of the information we have, it could be inferred that there are potential things that even Kris isn't telling Carol. Carol might be under the impression that they need the soul to open up dark worlds when in fact they don't. I don't have a lot to say about this, mostly because I'm not even sure if this is the case, but I just thought I'd mention that. I wanted to also quickly mention this. At some points, the text color changes from white to red. This is either because when the red voice is speaking, they are more terse and aggressive, or, more interestingly, there is another person on the line. Later, when Kris calls Carol and she learns that Susie has the guitar, the voice is upset, but the text color is still white. If we go by this understanding, then the white voice appears to be more worried about Kris losing the soul, hinting at what might happen if Kris and the soul were separated for too long. I can't say for sure that these are two different people, aside from the fact that they have two different temperaments. So I would love to hear what you think is happening here. We eventually make our way back to Des's room, and Kris is there waiting for us. Susie and Noelle hear the commotion and make their way inside, so now we are stuck in the closet with Kris. Noelle is telling Susie about this dream she had, while we and Kris are taking part in some slapstick comedy. Kris, no, you need me. This is awesome. Can I just say that this is awesome? No, ow. If we manage to make our way back to the guitar, Susie realizes we are in the closet and rips the guitar right out of Kris's hands, the specific thing they did not want to happen. Susie now has the guitar and Carol is on her way. At this point, we have won. Even though Susie is still unaware of our existence, the guitar with the code is in her hands, which allows her to notice the code inside. Susie, Noelle, and Asgore are all surprised to find that Carol Holiday is home early. She immediately removes the guitar from Susie's grasp and tells her to leave. In one last rambunctious display of rebellion, Susie scoffs at the bovine, proudly stating that she will be the one to take Noelle to the festival. Before we get a chance to leave, Carol makes it a point to stop us, apologize, and in a massive curveball, she says, "You are welcome here anytime." Okay, so what just happened? Let me try to understand this. Kris is working with Carol Holiday. They call her after we almost find the code for the shelter inside the guitar. Kris only acted when they saw that we were about to learn the code. So that tells us that they did not know that the code was there. To be honest, Kris was kinda too late. Given everything we know about the holidays, I think it's obvious that the code was 1225. Because, Christmas. And, Christmas is like their entire thing. And come to think of it, there was another code earlier back in chapter 3 that was also 1225. I wonder if that security locked door has a light world equivalent. Maybe it's hiding in Toriel's room? The most interesting thing about this is that Carol didn't know the code was there either. When she grabs it from Susie, she looks inside to confirm it's there, like she couldn't believe that it was there in the first place. The question is, who put it there? That guitar belonged to December, so my first and only guess would be that she's the one who put the code there. But that wouldn't make any sense. At this point in time, I am almost certain that December is the night. There was such a massive telegraph that would point towards it being her that it doesn't make any sense that she wouldn't just get rid of the guitar. I mean, she wants this plan to succeed, right? Why not put the guitar someplace no one would find it? Maybe there was a part of her that wanted the shelter to be found? Maybe this is just where she kept the code before she turned into the night? Really, we don't know. What we do know is that Kris was adamant about not letting us get it. Kris is now actively stopping us from getting inside the shelter, so we can assume that they also do not want us to rescue Officer Undyne. Why is this? Well, still going off my understanding from earlier, if Undyne escapes, she will ruin the plan, and potentially put Toriel back in danger. As far as we know, they still need Toriel, but then again, maybe they don't. Asgore is now working for Carol as well, and considering he will play a major role in Chapter 5, I think it's obvious that they could just go for him instead. Heck, at this point he would probably just give them what they want willingly. And this would naturally explain why the knight was just willing to take Undyne instead of Toriel. So now all they need to do is to make sure that Undyne doesn't escape. Everything about this plan appears to be contingent about the soul not entering the shelter, because if it did, then we would probably continue on and seal the dark fountain inside. Whatever this group needs to happen, I think it relies on the dark worlds continuing to form. If not for a specific reason, they are great distractions for the fun gang, keeping them away from the important dark world. Kris is now working with Carol, and on top of that bombshell, we now know that she is aware of the dark worlds, and more interestingly, she is also aware of us. She knows that the soul exists, but is under the impression that Kris needs the soul to open up a fountain when they really don't. She also appears to value this partnership highly. We know Carol Holiday for a few seconds, but the way she commands the room is very telling. She's cold, calculated, and straight to the point. Pay attention to the way she talks to everyone in the room. Telling Susie to leave, telling Asgore to eat outside, telling Noelle to wait in the kitchen. But when we get to Kris, she smiles, apologizes, treating them with higher regard. Everyone in this room has to do what she says, because she has power over them. When she gets to Kris, she apologizes, reaffirming them that you are welcome here. You is almost universally used to identify the player, and this understanding is reinforced by the fact that the word is in bright red. Carol is aware of our presence and needs us to work with her, or rather needs Kris to force us to work with her. She needs something from Kris, so she treats Kris with mutual respect. This is a business partnership. Now, does Carol actually respect Kris? Probably not. It's more likely that Kris is a high-value asset. And based on their continued cooperation, it would appear that Kris is convinced that what they are doing is worth it, even after Rousey's speech. So either they know something that we don't, or they are being manipulated by Carol, or they know all of the risks associated with opening up the dark worlds, and they don't care. They will press on regardless, because they also want something out of this partnership. Before we move on, can I just say something really quick? The level of Kris slander I've been seeing since this reveal has been crazy. Are we really just writing Kris off that quickly? Are we not even going to entertain the idea for a second that Kris is being groomed? Look at that creepy smile. Kris knew Carol for years before they met Rousey. She's an old family friend who clearly has been up to some nefarious things. But Kris would more swiftly trust her than Rousey, given the previously mentioned history. Kris has known Rousey for like 3 days, tops, and on top of that, he lies. So it would only make sense that Kris would side with her. I just hope we find out what the truth is before it's too late. This is such a strange predicament we find ourselves in as the player of this video game. Usually, when there's this great threat or some evil plot that could lead to the destruction of the world, the player has a way to overcome adversity and solve the problem, win the game. However, I can honestly say this is the first time a video game has presented me with the dilemma of the main character themselves actively sabotaging me. The main character of the story is working against me for the bad guys without me or other characters knowing, and there is very little I can do about it because Kris doesn't like us. So, is it over? Kris keeps us locked up in a bird cage, carries around a knife, eats all of the pie, opens up dark worlds, and is working with the knight behind Susie's back? Is this definitive proof that Kris is just evil and they want the world to end? Some people may think so, but I'm not one of them. I can totally understand why you may look at Kris and judge them for everything they're doing, but I know there's more to it. If Kris really wanted the roaring to happen, then they could have just done it a long time ago. Kris was alone several times in Chapter 3. All they would have to do is walk off someplace by themselves, make a fountain, wait a bit longer, and then make another one. For now, we don't know if Kris has the capacity to remove the soul while in a dark world. I don't see why they can't. It's not like the dark world stops them. Honestly, that's probably going to be the next subversion. I've noticed that every single time Kris removes the soul, it's always been unexpected. Like the first time, it was when they were sleeping, the second time was before they went to sleep, and then the third time was during the day, so the next time they do it, it will probably be when they're inside a dark world, because, we haven't seen them do that yet. The point is, they don't need us to open up fountains. If they wanted to cause the roaring, they would have done so. During one of the numerous times they were alone, Kris is not a directionless monster. They still have thoughts, desires, and feelings, and even though it may not seem like it's there, they still have a soul. I know what you're going to say. If they have their soul, then why do they need us? Honestly, I don't know, because nobody knows. It's still one of Deltarune's greatest mysteries. But we can't see determination, and we know it's real. So why would the soul be any different? I know it's in there somewhere, we just need to help them find it. There is this moment in the kitchen that happens should you choose to fly out of the vent. Kris will initially stare at you, and you can share a moment of silence with them. Usually they'll just jump out and grab you, but if you manage to make it all the way over to the piano, Kris will stun you and toss you back into the storage room. But if you go back, you will be treated to something very special. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that Kris plays the piano twice in Chapter 4. So, really quick, how the heck does Susie and Noelle not hear this? That piano is pretty big. Some may say it's a grand piano, and it's probably very loud. They hear the guitar but not the piano, and whatever, it's not a big deal. Well, this is a big deal, because, well, just listen. Kris is playing the piano. Music is an art form, an outlet, a means of expressing emotions, a way to entertain, a way to communicate, a way to be human. Music is a language that anyone can understand. It evokes emotion, it evokes passion. It reminds you that we can all connect with each other. It's an unexpected deviation from the intended purpose of the eardrum. We evolved the ability to hear to sense predators. Evolution never thought of this. Even though it never had to, music evolved with us, changing form, becoming more complex. But the universal understanding is that it has always been connected to the soul. Come on, listen to that. Listen to that music and tell me Kris doesn't have a soul. I can hear you, Kris. I know you're in there. Somewhere. There is no logical reason they do this. They weren't instructed. We most certainly have nothing to do with it. So why do they do it? Simple. They just want to. Kris Dreemurr is a human being. Their soul may be scarred, but it is there, still there, somewhere. I can feel it. I know it's in there somewhere. We just have to help them find it again. I can't prove it aside from what I've already said, but, sometimes you just need to have faith in people. I think it goes without being said that Chapter 4 was Susie's chapter. There is so much stuff for Susie in the Church Dark World, and I look forward to talking about that in her video. But for now, there are some things about Kris we need to wrap up, including the ending. And I have some words to say about that ending. But for now, let's talk about the few remaining Kris moments in Chapter 4. To start, I wanted to briefly revisit something that I mentioned in the first Kris video that has remained a recurring theme. And that is the use of dog imagery and the mentioning of dogs in regards to Kris. In the first 2 chapters, I noticed a few instances where Kris was either compared to a dog or acted like a dog, and it seems to continue to happen. Toriel says that Kris slept like a puppy. Susie makes jokes about Kris's howling. They begin to playfully scratch at the game room door in Chapter 3. As strange as this may seem, after everything Kris has been through, I think it's fair to say that they got that dog in them, but I can't help but wonder why this keeps coming up. Toby Fox uses a dog sprite as his stand-in, using it for certain events whenever he wants to. So maybe this isn't the deprecating allegory that it appears to be? Considering Kris is someone who follows orders from us constantly, I would assume that they hate the comparison, and yet they don't seem to mind. If anything, they encourage it. Also, if this comparison was solely based on the fact that they have to do what we say, then I can't say it's very accurate. At the end of almost every single cutscene, Kris turns towards the screen, looking directly at us. They anticipate our next command. Dogs also have a habit of looking towards their human for affirmation or even guidance, but honestly, I can't say the dog's similarities are fitting. For example, a dog can't just stand up and decide to lock up their human whenever they want. They usually are more loyal than that, or rather not conniving enough to plot against their humans. I suspect this dog imagery and comparisons will continue, and as simple as it may seem, I'm not sure if it's as simple as Kris has to do what we say, therefore they act like a dog. Roots. The part of the plant from which it derives its nutrients and its support. Roots are used to represent your origins, the place where you come from. The best way to find the source of something is to track its roots. This area is connected to the egg room in Chapter 4. Unlike Chapter 3, this room is found the traditional way of moving in and out of the room in psychotic fashion. When you get to the egg room, you are placed inside of a hospital. The receptionist greets Kris, explaining that the patients are waiting for us. This appears to be a psychiatric hospital. Kris walks into the room, and we see nothing. Based on the flavor text, there is a tree, a man, and some painters. One of them says, "This is art class, where we draw pictures and don't kill each other." Talking to the man will make a canvas appear, which allows Kris to make a drawing. I'm sorry that I don't have visuals for this moment, so to make up for it, I will show you some of my drawings. Kris attempts to draw something, and then they stop. They start again, and then again. They repeat. They repeat this process several times, until finally they paint a tree over the several lines that they drew. The dialogue specifically says, "Painted over everything." They were trying to draw what they saw behind the tree, that being the man, and they just can't seem to do it. It's not that they don't have the artistic ability, they can paint the tree just fine. Every single time they try to put pencil to paper, they just can't seem to do it. Even the flavor text appears to be confused about what is happening. I believe this person is someone from Kris's past, someone they may have forgotten. This would coincide with Chapter 3's egg room, where the man is worried about being forgotten. Something I have noticed about all of these egg rooms is that it specifically says that there is a man. Not a monster, not a person, a man. I think this person is a human. I think this person is from Kris's past, and Kris tried to forget about them. After they are done, the man disappears, and an egg is added to your inventory. Walking over to the sink, Kris will attempt to wash their hands, but the flavor text reads, "You can never wash it all away." Painting is usually done for enrichment purposes. A hospital is usually sterile and uniform. Making a painting can give you a sense of freedom and mental stimulation. With that being said, I want to try to understand Kris's drawing. Every one of these lines are like roots. They start, but they don't go anywhere. Art like this is by nature freeform, but typically, The artist would draw a pencil sketch of what they were painting first. All Kris drew were lines, roots that never managed to form the intended shape. These are Kris's roots. Confusion, mistakes, inadequacies are littered throughout their early life. The paint is to represent the fact that Kris simply covered up their past, painted over it, letting no one see it. One of the painters, the one who talks about not killing people, is either a younger version of Kris or the memory of another person in this hospital. At one point, Kris was in a hospital, more than likely put there by their human parents. Perhaps the specific treatment was due to their behavior. Maybe the painting over the lines are violent impulses that Kris has covered up their entire life. This actually brings us back to what the Laughing Shadow said. There are primal and potentially destructive facets of Kris's mind that may have resurfaced recently. This could also be why the way to play the secret games is to use a sword and kill monsters. Perhaps that game Azrael was making was made to give Kris an outlet, a way to exercise their violent thoughts in a non-violent way. Looking back at the way Tenna described December, it would appear that there were certain types of shows and music that Kris was forbidden from watching. A psychologically instilled repression of more violent thoughts. We actually see this represented in game. I think there might be some anger from Kris towards Tenna. There are several instances in Chapter 3 where Tenna brings up several nostalgic memories from Kris's past, almost to a nauseating level, considering Tenna technically failed his intended purpose, while simultaneously reminding Kris of all their nostalgic memories. It would appear some anger and frustration built up over time, causing Kris to lash out at Tenna. During the Tenna fight, if you choose to fight Tenna with violence, Kris does a ridiculous amount of damage. All they have in this footage is the regular Saber 10, and yet, with their regular attacks, they're doing more damage than Susie's Rude Buster. I believe this is all made to tell us that Kris has repressed pent-up aggression that they have been painting over their entire life. I'm very interested to see how this pans out. Man, these egg rooms took a turn, didn't they? Remember the good old days where people just thought the man behind the tree was Gaster? Now I think it might actually be a repressed memory of Kris's biological father, or maybe even their therapist. After you seal the first Dark World, you end up back inside the lobby of the church. The first world was merely a decoy, to hinder you from getting closer. Kris and Susie search the area to try to find a way to open the door lock. Eventually, Susie gets the idea of opening up a dark world again to ask the old man for answers, and can I just say that is pretty much the worst idea I have ever heard. At this point, there would have been a total of 4 dark fountains open at the same time. That's 2 in the church, 1 in the shelter, and 1 in the school. Holy crap, if the balance of darkness and light wasn't messed up before, it will be. Then again, perhaps this is secretly meant to tell us that it really doesn't matter how many dark worlds are opened, and instead the real thing we have to look out for is when someone opens up a fountain inside of a dark world. And it honestly makes me wonder, later on the knight opens up another dark fountain, but wouldn't the dark fountain in the lobby cause a titan to appear? I noticed that the first dark fountain was a little bit smaller, so does that imply that a dark fountain can be weaker if you don't have as much energy? I'm getting off track here. Questions for later. The moment I want to bring up here is Kris showing Susie their knife. Susie needs something to open up a dark world, and Kris produces a knife. We can never access Kris's knife in their inventory for obvious reasons. They don't want us to get it. Susie is initially surprised by the knife, but then immediately grabs its sharp end. Susie is a monster, pretty tough one at that, so her grabbing the knife is not a surprise. What is the way that Kris blushes. Susie asks them if they always carry this around, making them blush, refusing to answer. Now would be as good a time as ever to talk about why Kris carries a knife. The obvious reason would be that they need it to open up dark worlds, and the more complex answer is, they probably feel exposed without it. Carrying around a sharp weapon is dangerous and irresponsible. But just because someone carries around a knife doesn't always mean that they intend it for bodily harm. A knife can be used as a tool, and just as easy used to inflict harm. But did you know that a knife can be also used for defense? Okay, yeah, I'm being sarcastic, you got me. It's almost implied that when someone carries a knife with them, they intend to use it, but I would go a step further and say that those who feel like they need a knife to protect themselves will carry a knife with them. Honestly, I'm not speaking from experience, I don't carry knives, I'm not an expert in knives, but a knife is a pretty solid deterrent for things that are scary. This world is scary, and Kris may feel especially scared, so, to make themselves feel safe, they may just keep the knife with them to do so. All things considered, this knife is kinda sacred to them. It makes them feel safe, so when they show it to Susie, it quickly becomes an intimate moment for Kris. Intimate, marked by a warm friendship developing through long association. This is important to Kris. They don't show their knife to everyone. As far as we know, the only people who actually know about it would be Toriel, who for some reason doesn't have an issue with it, us, because, we're always with them, and now Susie. I don't know why this is funny to me, but the fact that Kris is just standing there while Susie's making the dark world, it's just a funny visual to me. I can't really explain it. Look at Susie's eyes. They glow red briefly right before she makes the dark world. In the past, her eyes glowed yellow, but that was for dramatic effect. So now I wonder, are red eyes a symptom of opening up dark worlds? Is that why Kris's eyes glow red? Because they opened up so many? Honestly, I have no idea, but I think we will learn in time. In the past, I was torn over talking about the weird route, mostly because it didn't tell us too much about Kris. Yet now, strangely, the weird route is the most concrete piece of evidence that disproves third entity theory. The name Weird Route, at least in the context of Chapter 3 and 4, is a little misleading. Technically, it is still a route to take, but if anything, the events that follow are the aftermath. The quote-unquote weird route of Chapter 3 and 4 are really just one last chance to turn back. It's actually crazy how many chances the game gives you to stop a weird route, to the point where, at this point, I hope the player loses when the route is over. I am absolutely rooting for Kris in this situation, because at this point, the knight is a saint by comparison. Something that I wanted to make note of in the weird route is how Kris feels much more distant from Susie. Susie is still there to join us on adventures, but certain scenes that allow us to connect with her are not there. Kris and Susie do not share a high five. They do not seal the fountain with each other in Chapter 2. They don't hear Susie outside of their window. Instead, we force Kris to get creepily closer to Noelle. In between chapters, Kris went to Noelle's house to ensure her that everything in Chapter 2 was just a big joke. And it was all just a dumb prank. A prank, right? Just like all of the other ones in the past? Noelle is relieved, so relieved to hear Kris's voice again that she almost appears to be heartbroken. She feels like she hasn't heard Kris's voice in so long it makes her want to cry. Kris is afraid of what the player might do, so they tell Noelle to never speak of this ever again. She obviously doesn't listen, thinking she is safe as they are alone together. But as we know, they are not alone. We force Kris to put the thorn back into Noelle's finger, and the chime confirms that this was indeed a weird route. Kris becomes enraged, this being the only time they assault the soul out of spite rather than necessity. Kris attacking the soul was a normal occurrence, but beforehand they had a reason. This time, it's a lot more personal this time, and genuinely, valid crash out. Something important to note is that Kris loses health due to the beatdown they give the soul. This heavily implies that what happens to the soul happens to Kris as a result. This could also be seen as a turning point for Kris in the context of the weird route. Before, they felt like if they kept the soul in check, everything would be fine. On the contrary, things are only getting worse, and it appears that they may soon get to a point where they will kill the soul to protect the people they care about, even if it means a mutually assured destruction. They probably would have done more damage had Asgore not interrupted them. Speaking of damage, I neglected to mention this before. Both times that Kris takes out the soul in either route, they stumble after getting it back. Maybe they left the soul out for too long and became weaker as a result. Or maybe even their body is getting weaker in general. Either way the story goes, they might not have a lot of time left. These events are pretty scary, but they tell us definitively that Kris cares about Noelle and doesn't want any harm to come to her. Unfortunately, they might not have a say when the time comes. After we leave the church, The Place Where It Rained plays. This song took a lot of people by surprise, not just because of the nostalgic jump scare, but an answer to an old question we didn't even know we were being asked. This place, Deltarune, hometown, wherever, this is the place where it rained. Walking over to the lake, Susie and Kris will sit down like they usually do. This moment is melancholic for them. They won, technically, but they are no closer to saving Undyne, and let's be honest, if Gearson didn't show up, they would have been toast. Susie mentions a song she can hear across the lake, the very same Onion mentions to you in Chapter 2. But we're not here to talk about that, however. Kris will eventually begin to stare at Susie. She, understandably, doesn't understand why, but I bet she's too mentally drained to push the issue. If you wait long enough, a text box will appear, and we can tell Kris to speak their mind. We are giving Kris the ability to say whatever they want. Concentrate their thoughts and concerns into a single sentence. Free reign. They can tell Susie whatever it is they want, and they don't. They speak, but they keep their mouth shut to stop the words from escaping. This specific event is unique in such that by design, this command is meant to give Kris a sense of freedom, and yet they don't take it. Now, of course, they don't need to share anything they don't want to, that is the point. In a way, we were kinda forcing them to speak their mind. That's the thing, they clearly had something to say, something they were thinking about, and they chose not to say it. Maybe it was about Susie, maybe it was about Noelle, maybe it was about the impending doom that is approaching them, should more Dark Worlds be opened, and they fear for Susie's safety. There was something internally holding Kris back from being open and honest with Susie, and for once, I don't believe it's us. It's unclear for now, but I think it's time we wrap things up. Kris Dreemurr is a conundrum of narrative, a meta-twist on the age-old story of identity. The complicated question of self is one that we all must answer at some point, and unfortunately that question is harder for some than it is for others. In this never-ending night, they still care about their family and the nostalgic memories associated with them. They want to rekindle the old memories of the past because they felt happier then, so they want nothing more than to feel that love again. There is more to their story to follow, especially pertaining to December holiday. There is a shirt in her closet that looks a lot like Kris's, probably a gift from her to them or vice versa. The allegorical implications of the black deer moving in tandem with Kris along with their recently revealed partnership tells of a bond yet to be explained. Something happened to Des, and it potentially has a lot to do with Kris. Either through guilt or compassion, Kris wants nothing more than to help her. They want nothing more than to find her. We are still controlling Kris, parading around their body like a fleshy puppet, only occasionally losing control when they deem it absolutely necessary. They stagger, almost as if they can't be without us for too long, or maybe even their body itself is deteriorating. No matter the struggle, they will continue on, and it makes you wonder how they stay determined through all of this. We find ourselves back at the question, what is the source of Kris's determination? If you have been following along, paying attention, then you probably already know the answer. To ask where one derives determination, one must understand it. Determination is not a power you draw from that allows you to win. It is the strength that allows you to fail, and fail, and fail, and fail, and fail again, until you finally succeed. Will they succeed? I hope so. I want them to because they're just a kid. and they have a lot going on right now. To find determination, you must first find failure. And what do we see every single time we fail? We hear Susie, we hear Rouse, we hear the cries of our friends telling us that we are stronger than this, egging us on to keep going. For that is the source of Kris's determination, their friends, their family, the people they care about, the people they continue to live for despite how dire their situation becomes. They may not know who or what they are, but that's okay, because they know for a fact that they are determined to find out. Thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye. Why is Susie bleeding? Susie? Susie, you're bleeding. Why are you bleeding? Well, everybody bleeds, right? Everybody bleeds. Hey everyone, I want to thank you for watching my first updated Deltarune video. I really wanted to be thorough this time around, but I'm sure I still missed a few things. I would love to hear what you thought of the video. If you could, let me know what you think. I would appreciate it. I'm sure I missed a few things here and there, but at some point you just gotta cut things off.